12,000 years ago, humanity made a decision that altered the course of history forever. This is the story of farming, the bedrock of civilization, and why it may have been the greatest mistake we ever made. The earth itself felt different beneath human steps in those years. For uncounted generations, people had followed the migrations of animals, tracked the ripening of fruits, and moved in harmony with the untamed cycles of the world. Yet something began to change. In scattered regions across the globe, small groups of people started staying in one place. They noticed how fallen seeds sprouted again in the same patches of soil. They saw that certain animals could be encouraged to linger nearby. Wild grasses with their fat, nourishing seeds caught their eyes. What if those seeds were planted intentionally? What if they could persuade plants to grow exactly where they wanted them? At first it seemed a minor adjustment, just a small twist in the timeless relationship between humans and nature. No one could have imagined what would follow. No one could have foreseen the enormous cost of this seemingly harmless experiment. The earliest farming villages appeared almost like cautious trials, clusters of crude shelters set beside fields cleared of brush. People who once followed the turning seasons now watched a single piece of land through spring, summer, and autumn. Grain meant surplus. Surplus meant stability. Stability meant expansion. Villages appeared where nomadic camps once stood. Villages grew into towns. Towns swelled into cities. For the first time in human memory, a child could be born, grow up, and die in the very same place as their grandparents. This monumental transformation would later be called the Neolithic Revolution, the dawn of what we now call civilization, the root of our modern existence. For countless generations, humanity celebrated this shift as our proudest achievement. We told ourselves it was a story of progress, of triumph over uncertainty, of order replacing chaos. But in 1987, a startling counterpoint emerged. Evolutionary biologist Jared Diamond published an essay in Discover magazine titled, with a shocking claim, "The worst mistake in the history of the human race." By mistake, he meant farming itself. At first glance it sounded absurd. How could the foundation of everything we know, our cities, our technology, our societies, be called a blunder? From our vantage point, modern life looks infinitely better than what came before. The hunter-gatherer existence strikes us as brutal and precarious. We imagine constant hunger, endless wandering through unforgiving wilderness, constant threats from predators and storms, a life perpetually at the edge of survival. But the evidence Diamond presented told a far more unsettling story, and that story was written not in books or myths, but in bones. For decades, bioarchaeologists had been studying the silent testimony of ancient skeletons. Their findings revealed an alarming pattern repeated across continents and cultures. Wherever agriculture took hold, human health collapsed, and not just slightly dramatically. The most visible change appeared in human height. A cross-regional study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences analyzed more than 11,000 skeletons. The results were consistent almost everywhere. Average adult stature shrank once agriculture arrived. In regions like Anatolia and the Levant, men lost as much as 6 inches in height. Women lost around 5. In China, the first rice farming communities stood noticeably shorter than their foraging predecessors. From the Nile Valley to the Indus Basin, the story was the same. Height reflects nutrition and early life stress, and these declines meant that the children of early farmers grew up malnourished, compared to hunter-gatherer ancestors. Their bodies never achieved their full genetic potential. The evidence didn't stop there. Examined closely, the skulls of early agriculturalists often revealed porous lesions in the cranial bones and eye sockets, conditions known as cribroorbitalgia and porotic hyperostosis. Both are clear indicators of iron deficiency anemia. In Neolithic settlements like Çatalhöyük in Turkey and Abu Huraira in Syria, up to 60% of skeletons bore these marks. Some even showed multiple overlapping nutritional disorders. None of these patterns appear in earlier hunter-gatherer remains. Their teeth tell the same grim tale. Dental health plummeted after farming began. Foragers generally had worn but relatively clean teeth with few cavities, since their diets were varied, fibrous, and low in sugar. Farmers, by contrast, lived on soft, carbohydrate-heavy cereals. The result? cavities multiply. Enamel hyperplasia, lines on teeth caused by childhood malnutrition, became widespread. Gum disease spread unchecked. At Ganj Dere in Iran, a site nearly 10,000 years old, more than 80% of adult skeletons showed severe dental decay. In Neolithic Nubia, archaeologists discovered that almost every adult molar was rotten or abscessed. Some skulls even had gaping holes where tooth infections had eaten through the jawbone. The agony these people must have endured is unimaginable. Unlike us, they had no dentists, only pain and the constant risk of deadly infection. Taken together, this evidence tells us something profound, something that shatters the tidy story of human progress. The first farmers worked harder, ate worse, got sicker, and died younger than the foragers they replaced. Their skeletons carried unmistakable marks of their new way of life. Their spines showed advanced wear and tear. Their knees and ankles deteriorated, often before adulthood. Farming reshaped not just their societies, but their very bones. Hours bent over planting, weeding, and harvesting grain left their mark on human bodies forever. The bones tell us the story. Many skeletons reveal twisted big toes, likely the result of long hours spent kneeling while grinding grain with heavy stone tools. Forearm bones display signs of enthosopathies, evidence of torn muscles from constant repetitive motion. This was not leisurely gardening, it was exhausting, back-breaking labor, and it was fueled by a diet built on bowls of nutrient-poor gruel. The contradiction grows sharper the closer we look. Farming was supposed to liberate us from hunger, from scarcity, from the endless wandering that hunting and gathering required. Yet what we see in those first settled communities isn't freedom. We see children who stopped growing, jaws riddled with infection, vertebrae collapsing under the strain of work. We see disease etched into bone, generation after generation, which forces us to ask, not why humans began farming, but why they never turned back once the cost became clear. Why didn't they abandon this harsher, more fragile lifestyle and return to the ways that had kept them healthier for so long? The answer lies in the nature of farming itself. Once it began, agriculture created its own trap. By the time the pain was visible in people's bodies, it was already too late to reverse course. Farming did more than change how humans lived. It reshaped what was necessary to survive. The first villagers produced only just enough food to sustain their swelling population. More children meant more hands to work the fields. More workers meant more mouths to feed. More mouths required more land. Population growth made the hunter-gatherer way of life mathematically impossible. There were too many people for the wild resources left on the land. The foraging system hadn't stopped working. Humanity had simply outgrown it. Returning to the old ways would have meant starvation, with the most vulnerable elders, infants, pregnant women suffering first. No community could willingly condemn itself to such an outcome. And so, generation after generation, they stayed. Grain fields spread wider, villages thickened, the trap closed further. But something else emerged in those crowded, permanent settlements. Something silent but deadly. Disease. Before farming, people lived in small groups of maybe 20 to 50, always moving, always leaving their waste behind. They rarely stayed anywhere long enough for pathogens to build a foothold. But sedentary life changed everything. Humans now lived next to their trash heaps, alongside domesticated animals, drinking from the same streams they used for washing. Population density soared, and with it infection rates exploded. Villages became perfect breeding grounds for bacteria and viruses. Archaeological remains confirm this dark shift. Bones from early farming sites show signs of respiratory infections, sinus inflammation, and even tuberculosis. Some skulls display jaw abscesses so severe, the bone itself crumbled away. This was more than occasional sickness. It was the beginning of a permanent new relationship between humans and disease, and we are still living with its consequences today. As this first chapter of farming draws to a close, we can see the outline of the bargain our ancestors unknowingly made. They traded movement for rootedness, dietary variety for stored calories, relative health for a fragile sense of stability. When they sowed the first seeds, they also planted the beginnings of inequality, conflict, and ecological fragility, forces that would define the next 12,000 years. But those are stories for later. For now, as night settles over those first fields, The villagers sleep in their mud brick homes, unaware that their descendants will one day question whether this innovation was salvation or mistake. Dawn breaks across the ancient settlement. Smoke rises. Children cough in the stagnant, smoky air. Something fundamental has shifted between humans and the microbial world. Before agriculture, diseases could not spread far. Hunter-gatherer groups were too small, too scattered, too mobile to sustain epidemics. Waste was left behind. Populations never dense enough to keep pathogens alive for long. But farming created the perfect stage for an invisible revolution. A landmark study published in Nature by William McNeill, later expanded on by researchers like Wolfe, Donovan, and Diamond, traced the birth of many devastating diseases back to this very transition. The Neolithic world brought humans into constant contact with animals. From cattle came measles, from goats, tuberculosis, from camels, smallpox, from pigs and ducks, influenza. These were not accidents. They were the inevitable result of sharing daily life with livestock. Grain storage, so essential for survival, drew rodents into human spaces. Rodents carried fleas. Fleas carried plague. The bacteria that would one day unleash the Black Death already lurked in these first settlements. The real danger wasn't simply that diseases leapt from animals to humans. The danger was what happened next. Once inside dense, immobile populations, pathogens adapt. They evolve to spread more effectively, to linger longer, to kill more slowly so they could infect more hosts. Early villages became evolutionary playgrounds for microbes. The more humans settled, the more sophisticated their microbial enemies became. Some diseases could not even exist until populations grew beyond certain thresholds. Whooping cough and typhoid fever, for example, require communities of roughly 200,000 people to remain endemic. Farming, by encouraging larger interconnected settlements, pushed us past those thresholds. Pathogens were no longer occasional invaders. They became permanent residents. Medical historians call this moment the first epidemiological transition. It was the point when humans no longer died mainly from accidents, hunger, or exposure, but from malnutrition, infection, and chronic disease. Yet despite this grim new reality, there was no turning back. The system they had built had no reverse gear. Agriculture was a treadmill. Stop moving forward, and you starved. By the time our ancestors realized what they had unleashed, it was already too late. The microbes had made their home among us, but sickness wasn't the only change. Alongside the fields of wheat and barley, another force was taking root: power. Before farming, there was little opportunity for hierarchy. Groups were small, food could not be stored for long, land belonged to everyone, and anyone who hoarded too much risked being cast out. Equality was not an ideal, but a survival necessity. But with agriculture, the rules changed forever. Grain, wheat, millet, barley, was not just food, it was storable wealth. And with the moment food could be stored came the possibility of ownership. Grain was no longer just sustenance. It could be counted, hidden, traded, guarded, or seized. For the very first time in our history, humans were capable of producing more than they immediately needed. And from that surplus, something profound was born: hierarchy. Bioarchaeologist Peter Bogocki, in his studies of prehistoric inequality, argued that this wasn't a side effect of farming, it was baked into its logic. When a few individuals could claim more food, more land, or more livestock, they gained leverage over others. Surplus could be turned into favors, into alliances, into marriages, into obligations. Eventually, it solidified into laws. The earliest elites didn't need divine blessing or superior intelligence or vast armies. They simply needed storage pits and patience. The archaeological record confirms the shift. At Varna, a 6,500-year-old cemetery in modern-day Bulgaria, lies one of the earliest clear signs of extreme wealth division. One man was buried with over 1,000 gold ornaments, more than all other graves combined. His bones show no trace of hard labor. He had not earned his wealth through sweat, but siphoned it from the toil of others. Across Mesopotamia, at sites like Tel Brak and Uruk, we see the same unfolding. Around 5,000 years ago, vast storage facilities appeared: granaries, warehouses, administrative halls where clay tokens tracked harvests and tributes. Here we find the birth of accounting, the first stirrings of bureaucracy, the dawn of taxation. All of this developed before writing, before coins, long before modern economies. Once food could be measured, someone would measure it. Once it could be stored, someone would guard it. And once it could be compared, someone would always want more. This wasn't a flaw in agriculture, it was its core engine. Farming fed more people, but it didn't feed them equally. Often the more abundant the food supply, the sharper the inequality became. In 2011, anthropologist Jean-Pierre Bouquet published a sweeping review in Science, describing the Neolithic demographic transition, the moment human populations surged in early farming regions. This explosion didn't just stretch resources, it demanded control. Who would distribute land? Who would oversee labor? Who would defend the stores? The answer increasingly fell to those who already commanded the most. Surplus birthed specialization. Specialization birthed stratification. Stratification birthed authority. This was the beginning of inheritance, property, and entrenched class systems. For the first time in history, a child could be born poor, not because of bad luck, not from injury, but because the structure of society had made poverty hereditary. Upward mobility was no priority. Survival was. The status of parents was passed to children, the same work repeated across lifetimes. This cycle endured for countless generations. Agriculture didn't create oppression from nothing, but it gave oppression roots, permanence, and legitimacy. And once someone had more than others, they had to defend it. Power required protection, and protection required force. As the golden waves of grain swayed across the first cultivated fields, another force took root: violence, but not the sporadic violence of personal quarrel. This was systematic, organized, and purposeful. The moment there was something to guard, there was something to steal. What comes more naturally to those with nothing than envy of those with plenty? As food became property and land became territory marked with boundaries, violence escalated into something larger than individual disputes. War was born not as accident, but as policy, as a structure, as a survival strategy. In small forager groups, conflict had always existed, but it was sporadic and personal. A disagreement over resources could usually be resolved simply by moving elsewhere. Land wasn't owned. Resources weren't fixed in one spot. Mobility released tension like steam from a vent. But farming shut that valve forever. Fields couldn't be abandoned at the first sign of strife. Granaries couldn't be carried to safer ground. When drought hit, when hunger loomed, when jealousy rose, there was no leaving. There was only fighting. The evidence for this transition is sobering. At Jebel Sahaba, along the Nile Valley, a 13,000-year-old cemetery reveals the earliest known large-scale violence. 61 skeletons were unearthed, nearly all bearing wounds from weapons. Almost half still had stone points embedded in their bones. Some bodies contained a dozen projectiles. Others had shattered arms and hands from desperate defense. The graves were layered, evidence of repeated raids over time. This was no one-off massacre. This was sustained conflict, and it happened right on the cusp of the shift from foraging to farming. The timing is no coincidence. Across continents, the same pattern emerges. As grains filled the storehouses, as villages expanded, violence intensified. What began as isolated disputes blossomed into organized, large-scale killing. War became a way of life. And so, as twilight settles over these ancient fields, we glimpse the shape of a new human world taking form, a world where plenty and famine exist side by side, where ownership brings obligation, where some command while others obey. The foundations of civilization were being laid: hierarchy, inequality, bureaucracy, war. The granaries stood heavy in the fading light, and over them the shadows of power and conflict lengthen. As others sleep beneath the quiet canopy of stars, guards keep watch, ensuring that some eat more richly than others under the same night sky. This was a turning point in human existence, the moment when inequality became a lived reality. Its consequences would ripple through the ages, shaping battles, constructing empires, and giving rise to the very division between those who have and those who do not. Yet in these early villages, as nocturnal creatures stir beyond the perimeter, those consequences remain mere shadows of what is to come. The fields rest in silence, waiting for daylight, when once again the endless cycle of sowing, tending, and harvesting will resume. a cycle that has ensnared humanity and continues to dictate our lives even now. Leap forward 6 millennia from these first sparks of conflict, and the scale of organized violence had grown alongside the settlements themselves. In Talheim, Germany, archaeologists uncovered a grim discovery, a mass grave dating to roughly 5000 BCE. Within it lay the remains of 34 people, 16 adults, 9 children, and 9 infants. Most bore crushing blows to their skulls, likely from stone axes. Some skulls carried multiple identical wounds, pointing not to chaotic violence, but to deliberate, methodical execution. What was perhaps most haunting was what the site lacked. Young adult women were conspicuously absent from the grave, not among the dead. The evidence strongly suggests they were taken, claimed as spoils of conflict. Just over 100 kilometers away, at Schöneck-Kilienstatten, another site told a similar story. Their 26 bodies were unearthed, bearing horrific injury. Fractures in legs and pelvises indicated victims were deliberately crippled or tortured before death. This wasn't rash bloodshed, it was targeted, systematic brutality, and Talheim and Schöneck were not anomalies. A 2016 study published in Nature, surveying dozens of early Neolithic massacre sites across Europe, showed that mass killings surged in frequency as farming cultures expanded, especially within the linear pottery culture between 5. These weren't disputes over temporary hunting rights. These were entire communities eradicated, women and children included, over land, food and herds. But why did violence escalate with farming? Anthropologist Jean-Pierre Bacquer-Pull's demographic transition model offers insight. Agriculture triggered explosive population growth, skyrocketing by 400–600% within just a few generations. Yet farmland doesn't expand as effortlessly as human mouths to feed. Every new child demanded sustenance. Each harvest required defense. Every drought strained neighboring villages to the breaking point. Pressure built until conflict became inevitable. Lawrence Keeley, in his 1996 book War Before Civilization, argued that in early farming societies, as many as 1 in 4 adult males may have perished from combat-related injuries, a rate far higher than many modern wars. By contrast, among forager groups studied in ethnographic records, violent death rates rarely exceeded 1%. This shift revealed a stark truth. Surplus not only invited defense, but also raiding grain stores, stealing animals, abducting laborers, torching rival fields before harvest. These were no longer acts of impulse but carefully planned tactics. Violence had become strategy. The very architecture of early communities began to mirror this transformation. The walls of Jericho, built around 8000 BCE, rose nearly 12 feet high atop a stone foundation 6 feet thick. Such defenses were unnecessary for wild animals or weather. They were built to resist human assault. Fortified villages emerged throughout the Near East, and the Balkans by 6000 BCE, outfitted with towers, moats, and guarded gates. War was no longer an interruption. It had become a blueprint. Archaeology uncovers an even darker shift in Neolithic Anatolia, at Chayunub, where excavators revealed the infamous skull building. Inside lay human skulls separated from their bodies, possibly arranged as displays or for ritual use. In one adjoining room, soil analysis revealed dense traces of human blood. Whether executions, sacrifices, or instruments of terror, the message was the same: fear had become institutionalized. This era marked a profound change in how humans waged conflict. Once violence became a tool for managing resources, controlling borders, and dominating people, it no longer stopped with the defeat of individuals. It extended to their families, their descendants. Agriculture gave us food security, but it also gave us a motive for systematic slaughter and organized oppression. By the rise of empires, war wasn't an exception. It had become the steady background rhythm of civilization itself. Yet the visible fortifications were only half the story. Alongside stone walls, invisible barriers were erected, crafted from custom, belief, and law. One was not merely born into a settlement, but into a role. The true innovation of the agricultural system wasn't simply producing more food, it was fixing people in place. The field you worked, the tools you handled, the dwelling you occupied, these were not only yours but also destined for your children and theirs after them. Land could now be inherited, and with it came status, work, and power. What began as practical, "this is my family's plot," hardened into structural permanence. This is your station, remain in it. This wasn't the result of a single plan, but the natural outgrowth of surplus, storage and counting. Once food and goods could be quantified, they could be taxed. Once taxed, someone needed to enforce collection, and someone else had to pay. To sustain the system, elites had to make their power appear natural, eternal, even sacred, and so formal law entered human history. The Code of Hammurabi, carved into basalt around 1750 BCA, wasn't merely the earliest extensive legal code, it was a worldview inscribed in stone. It didn't just forbid theft or violence, it carved society into layers, each with its own worth. Its structure split into 3 distinct sections. The prologue of Hammurabi's code begins with the king kindling his authority as divinely sanctioned, chosen above all by the gods, especially Marduk, to uphold justice, eradicate wickedness, and safeguard the vulnerable. He casts himself in the image of a shepherd, a guardian over his flock. From there, the body of the code unfolds, 28 laws addressing nearly every sphere of daily life: contracts, family matters, labor disputes, trade regulations, slavery, theft, assault, farming practices, and even sexual relations. And then comes the epilogue, the portion that most starkly reveals the rigidity of social mobility, or rather, the absence of it. Hammurabi warned future rulers never to alter his laws, threatening divine wrath on any king bold enough to change or disregard them. But what exactly did these laws mean for human relationships? Consider 3 often cited examples. Law 19:6 declares, "If a man blinds another man, his own eye shall be put out." This represents the principle of lex talionis, the notion of direct retribution, an eye for an eye. Yet, Law 19:8 softens dramatically when the victim is a commoner. If he blinds the eye of a commoner, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. The act is the same, but the punishment shifts depending on social class. And Law 19:9 is harsher still in its inequity. If he blinds the eye of a slave, he shall pay half the slave's value. Here the injured person is not even considered a full human being under the law, but property, whose damage must be reimbursed to the owner, not the slave. Hammurabi's code was never about equality. It etched inequality into stone, formally ranking human worth according to class, gender, and status. Its goal wasn't to eliminate violence or exploitation, but to channel them in a controlled manner that upheld order and preserved elite dominance. It was less a system of justice than a framework for predictable hierarchy, a philosophy given teeth by authority and force. And this phenomenon was not confined to Mesopotamia. In ancient Egypt, tomb arrangements reflected rank rather than kinship. In the Indus Valley, water access and street design revealed rigid caste-like divisions. In Neolithic China, even the skeletons of children displayed signs of chronic stress and malnutrition that correlated directly with the quality of grave goods they were buried with. Before they had even learned to walk, their destinies were already sealed. A 2017 paper in Nature Communications, analyzing Bronze Age cemeteries, confirmed the trend. Wealth, authority, and ritual privileges flowed overwhelmingly through elite male lineages. High-status burials, property inheritance, and ceremonial roles were concentrated in a few families who maintained their dominance across generations. The powerful remained powerful, while others vanished into silence, forgotten except as anonymous bones beneath the soil. What hardened over centuries was an idea deeply rooted in human thought. Some were born to command, others born to serve. Farming had not invented inequality, but it made it scalable. And once hierarchy became tradition, became custom, became the way things are, it no longer needed chains of iron. The true shackles existed in the mind. Most of the oppressed did not even dream of revolt because their situation appeared ordained by the gods, by nature, by destiny. The system reinforced itself not only with force, but with narrative. Stories arose in prayers, in contracts, in the songs mothers whispered to their children at night. Over time, inequality grew invisible, not because it vanished, but because it was normalized. To reject it would have meant tearing down the only order anyone had ever known, the land. the labor, the laws, even the names they carried. So the sun rose each day over ancient fields where laborers bent low, overseers watched, and guards patrolled with sharpened weapons. Some households feasted while others starved. Tall walls ringed the settlements. The system was flawed, but it functioned. Agriculture supported more people than hunting and gathering ever could. It laid the groundwork for cities, temples, mathematics, written language. It inspired astronomy, irrigation systems, taxation, and trade networks. Civilization itself rose from the soil of wheat and barley, and from the bones of countless lives spent sustaining it. But this grand foundation was more brittle than it appeared. Farming was not the secure, stable bedrock it seemed. It was a balancing act, a tightrope stretched precariously over droughts, plagues, crop failures, and delicate trade routes. The more societies invested in a single staple crop, a single river, a single season's yield, the more catastrophic the risk when things went wrong, and things went wrong often. In Mesopotamia, irrigation brought unintended consequences. Water raised salts from deep in the earth, poisoning fertile soil. At first, farmers adapted by switching from wheat to barley, which could tolerate higher salinity, but eventually, even barley harvests collapsed. A landmark 1958 study by Jacobson and Adams in Science found that wheat yields in Sumer fell by more than 50%, a decline that contributed to the collapse of once great cities, such as Ur and Lhasa. The cradle of writing and empire gradually turned into a wasteland of dust. In the Indus Valley, the decline was environmental rather than military. Around 2100 BCE, shifts in monsoon patterns disrupted the agricultural calendar, crops withered, and settlements were abandoned. A 2003 study by Starbwasser and colleagues in Geophysical Research Letters linked the downfall of Harappan urban centers to a prolonged drought tied to the so-called 4.2 kilo-year event, a global climatic anomaly that battered nearly every early civilization. Egypt too faced this cycle of fragility. For centuries the Nile's floods were steady, dependable, a lifeline, until suddenly they weren't. Failed floods meant failed harvests. Starvation swept the land, sparking uprisings and unraveling dynasties. Pharaohs lost their aura of divine legitimacy when the granaries stood empty. The sacred order lasted only as long as the river's rhythm. Even the Maya, with their brilliant cities and knowledge systems, could not escape the trap. In the 9th century CE, devastating mega-droughts ravaged maize production. Populations collapsed, cities were abandoned. A 2012 study by Douglas Kennett and colleagues in Science showed that the environmental breakdown closely tracked the political fragmentation of Maya civilization. The bitter irony is clear. The same system that enabled the birth of civilization also sowed its fragility. Hunter-gatherers had little in the way of possessions to lose. Yet for all this fragility, those early peoples revealed astonishing resilience. When herds shifted across the plains, they followed. When plants failed in one valley, they adjusted their diet and moved to another. Mobility was their safety net. Farmers did not share that freedom. Their fates were tied to specific parcels of soil, and soil always carried limits. Increasingly, archaeological evidence confirms this pattern. Civilizations didn't primarily collapse under waves of conquest, but under the weight of their own ecological strain. Soils stripped of nutrients, forests felled beyond recovery, water sources pushed to exhaustion, communities tangled in fragile interdependencies. Joseph Tainter, in his landmark 1988 book The Collapse of Complex Societies, observed that the very intricacies that gave these cultures their strength also bred brittleness. Farming produced abundance, but it also left no buffer when conditions failed. And yet humanity pressed forward. With each ruined city came another, often rising with higher walls, deeper irrigation canals, stronger weapons, and heavier obligation. Because even though the system was harsh, it worked just enough to sustain. It filled granaries. It promised children a chance to live. It spun hope out of hardship. It offered the comforting illusion that humans could control their fate. But illusions are cost. People toiled harder than their bodies were designed for, often breaking under the strain. They endured poorer health, shorter lifespans, and confinement to land they could not abandon. They submitted to codes etched into stone, surrendered portions of their harvest to those who stored wealth in sealed chambers, and offered prayers of gratitude for the mere privilege of surviving another day. Picture it: the sun sinking over ancient tilled earth, laborers trudging back to crowded homes, some with full stomachs, many with little, guards pacing atop fortified walls, scanning for threats. A single day closing in a world agriculture had built, one we still inhabit, though reshaped in form. Its roots stretch back to choices made more than 12 millennia ago. That decision, though unspoken, bound humanity in an enduring contract. Nobody signed parchment, nobody carved it into stone, yet generation after generation has honored it. The bargain was simple: give up freedom, and gain stability. Stay rooted, cultivate the soil, heed the authority of elders, respect invisible boundaries, support the system. In return, survival was more likely, perhaps not plentiful, perhaps not just, but sufficient to see another season. Children were born, raised, and died in the same villages as their parents. Work stretched bodies to their limits, yet people reassured themselves it was worth it, because now they belonged to something larger than themselves. This was the story humanity told itself, the narrative we still echo. Today, even with only a fraction of the world's population working fields, we praise farming as progress, cities as inevitability, complexity as success. But what if this story is misleading? What if the Neolithic Revolution didn't mark the dawn of a golden age, but the opening of an elegant a system that gave us art, but also authority, writing but also taxation, temples but also tyranny? Civilization is often imagined as a ladder, each rung climbing higher, yet perhaps it is more fittingly seen as a web we stumbled in. Each new thread, ritual, law, surplus, hierarchy, tightened the net. With every layer added, escape became harder. Humanity did not step into this system deliberately, like choosing a meal or a song. It crept in, one cleared field at a time. By the time people sensed what they had given away, the arrangement had already sunk its roots into family lines and cultural memory. There was no turning back. Populations had grown too large, skills in foraging had faded, and beyond the fields lay the terrifying unknown. The repercussions of that ancient choice stretch far into our present lives. Consider the transformation it wrought upon humanity's sense of time. Foragers lived largely in immediacy, responding to the day's opportunity. Their lives followed cycles of migration and season, but rarely stretched planning beyond the next hunt or harvest of wild plants. Farming altered this relationship completely. Seeds sown in spring would not yield until autumn. Trees planted might feed generations yet unborn. Agricultural life demanded foresight, patience, deferred reward. This shift gave birth to linear time, to progress measured in harvests, dynasties, and centuries. Time itself became divisible, transferable, even ownable. My hours, your days, their years. To our nomadic ancestors, such notions would have been foreign. Agriculture also redefined humanity's stance toward nature. Foragers regarded themselves as woven into the fabric of life, one species among many, reliant on careful awareness of surrounding ecosystems. Farmers could not afford that view. Wild plants became weeds to clear, predators threats to livestock, whether a foe to be conquered. The language of domination entered human thought, taming wilderness, subduing land, forcing productivity from reluctant soil. That adversarial mindset only deepened with centuries. From the first burning of a forest, to make room for crops, to today's industrial mega-farms, the arc has bent toward mastery, exploitation, and management of nature, rather than cooperation with it. Spiritual life was not immune to this transformation. Foragers often embraced animism, seeing spirits in animals, rivers, mountains, and forests. Power was diffuse, relationships horizontal, sacredness abundant. Farming societies drifted toward hierarchical religions. The divine narrowed into fewer but more commanding gods, remote, demanding, sovereign. These mirrored the structures of human society. Kings ruled as gods, gods ruled as kings, and the social order became sanctified as cosmic from Mesopotamia's exaltation of Marduk, to China's mandate of heaven, to Egypt's divine pharaohs. The same pattern appears, theology entwined with hierarchy, legitimizing obedience and inequality. Religious texts and rituals reinforced the conviction that existing arrangements were not merely human agreements, but reflections of eternal cosmic order. Morality itself changed under agriculture. Foragers valued sharing, autonomy, and equality, virtues that sustained small groups on the move. Farmers elevated obedience, restraint, industry, and loyalty, qualities that supported planting, harvest, and hierarchy. Early Christian doctrine codified this agricultural morality. Sloth threatened productivity, gluttony endangered communal food stores, greed upset distribution, envy and pride challenged rank, lust and wrath jeopardized stability. The model citizen was the dutiful farmer, not the free-spirited wanderer. Even the human body was reconceived. In foraging life, value lay in adaptability, endurance, agility, keen perception. Agriculture narrowed this to repetitive, specialized labor. The human form became a tool of output measured in grain ground, fields tilled, hours endured beneath the sun. Calloused hands, stooped backs, strained eyes became common. Industrialization would later intensify this view, but its seeds were planted in the first furrows of wheat and barley. Social ties too hardened. Hunter-gatherer groups allowed flexibility. People could enter or leave, and leadership was often situational, based on consensus or skill. Agricultural societies developed borders, insiders and outsiders, citizens and foreigners. Authority became hereditary, leadership permanent, boundaries rigid. Even family life narrowed into the nuclear unit, with paternal descent and strict control of female sexuality, ensuring clear inheritance of property. Marriage itself shifted from a bond of shared partnership into something closer to the transfer of ownership. Children ceased to be only companions or community members, and increasingly became economic assets, sources of labor, heirs to property, living continuations of bloodlines and territorial claims. Nowhere is this transformation more visible than in gender relations. Anthropological records suggest that hunter-gatherer communities, while not perfect examples of equality, generally upheld more balanced relationships between men and women. Women in foraging groups contributed large portions of daily calories through gathering, often held significant independence, and were directly involved in group decisions. Farming disrupted this balance. With agriculture, roles solidified. Men dominated the plow, the fields, the herds, and the public spaces of ritual and governance. Women were increasingly confined to domestic life, child rearing, grinding grain, processing food, labor still essential, but stripped of its former autonomy and recognition. Their bodies became closely monitored for reproduction, their work subject to tighter control. This trend appeared so consistently in the archaeological record that some scholars now argue patriarchy was not an eternal truth of human existence, but rather a particular social structure born from agriculture itself. The hierarchies we once assumed natural may in fact be no older than the first furrows carved into fertile ground. Even our ways of thinking shifted with this transformation. Foragers tended to cultivate holistic, context-driven thought, an adaptive mindset suited to navigating the endless complexity of wild landscapes, relationships, and ecosystems. Farming, however, demanded precision and order. It encouraged linear reasoning, categorization, record-keeping, counting, dividing, measuring. These mental habits served agricultural societies well. They made it possible to plan harvests, track debts, and refine specialized crafts. But they also displaced other modes of understanding, the intuitive, the relational, the ecological knowledge that had guided human life for tens of thousands of years. None of these changes occurred overnight. They unfolded slowly, across generations, centuries, and then millennia, until they reshaped humanity so profoundly that the new frameworks became invisible. They molded how we think, how we feel, how we relate to one another, and to the world itself. They created assumptions so deeply ingrained that they seem timeless, when in truth they are only 12,000 years old, a blink of an eye in our species' long story. And here lies the paradox. For more than 95% of human history, we survived as foragers. Our bodies were shaped by natural selection for that existence. Our brains adapted to its challenges, our senses to its demands. Yet in the past 5% of that history, barely 12 millennia, we imposed upon ourselves a radically different life. No wonder we often feel out of place in the world we have built. This dislocation has a name: evolutionary mismatch. Our cravings for sweetness and salt, once critical survival instincts in environments where such nutrients were rare, now contribute to global epidemics of obesity and heart disease. Our social instincts, tuned for intimacy within small groups, strain under the weight of anonymous urban masses. Our attention, designed for scanning landscapes for prey and predators, is overwhelmed by flashing screens and relentless notifications. Stress, once an emergency signal for immediate threats, now burns constantly under the pressures of economics, bureaucracy, and social expectation. We remain hunter-gatherers trapped in the bodies and routines of farmers, nomadic spirits confined within apartments, offices, and schedules. This is not to suggest a return to pre-agricultural life is possible, or even desirable. History never allows backward step, but recognizing the depth of this transformation allows us to see that what we call modern life is not inevitable. It is a patchwork of decisions, adaptations, and compromises, chosen at particular moments in history to solve particular problems. Those choices opened opportunities, but they also imposed costs. And yet, alternatives did exist. Some cultures forged different paths, what anthropologists call complex hunter-gatherer systems. The indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, the Calusa of Florida, the Jomon of ancient Japan, these societies built permanent settlements, developed ritual and artistic traditions, and supported social complexity, all without fully embracing farming. They thrived with diverse diets and looser social constraints, proving that civilization could emerge without binding itself entirely to fields of wheat or rice. These pathways, however, were largely overshadowed by the dominance of agriculture. The Neolithic Revolution was not destiny. It was one choice among many in response to the climatic upheavals at the end of the Ice Age. It succeeded spectacularly in some ways, failed tragically in others, and set humanity on a course that continues to shape us in ways we are only beginning to fully grasp. And so, as the night deepens in our story, we return to that image. People resting beneath the same constellations that watched over those first farmers. The stars drift across the heavens. A cool wind stirs through the trees, and we are left to contemplate the weight of that ancient bargain, the decision that opened the path we still walk, the choice that made possible everything we now call civilization. So much of who we are today can be traced back to that first quiet moment when seeds were pressed into the earth of the ancient Middle East. From that decision 12,000 years ago, a bargain was struck, mobility exchanged for settlement, freedom bartered for security, health traded for abundance. That trade-off, that pact, still lingers in the fabric of our lives. Whether or not we acknowledge it, we continue to honor the weight of that choice. We still construct monuments to surplus, flatten forests in the name of expansion, and surrender autonomy in exchange for convenience, all under the banner of progress. Our laws, our cities, our daily lives, they rest upon foundations no living person remembers later. And while we no longer farm only in soil, our modern fields are digital, our crops are data, and our harvest flows endlessly, without pause. Perhaps this is better, perhaps it has advanced us, but the deeper question remains: was this the only possible path? Could humanity have charted a different course? The archaeological record hints at possibilities that complicate the story. In regions blessed with rich resources, some cultures evolved into what anthropologists call complex hunter-gatherer society. Along the salmon-rich rivers of the Pacific Northwest, indigenous peoples created permanent villages, intricate art traditions, and vast trade networks, all without fully embracing farming. In Florida, the Coast constructed shell-mound towns and engineered elaborate waterways, sustained largely by fishing. In Japan, the Jomon culture built some of the world's earliest pottery, lived in stable villages for millennia, and developed a sophisticated culture long before adopting rice cultivation. These societies reveal that complexity did not always require plowed fields. They lived with diverse diets, greater flexibility and often more balanced social relations, while still fostering art, ritual and innovation. They remind us that agriculture was not the only road to civilization, merely the one most traveled. Even early farming communities themselves were not locked into the rigid image we often picture. Many practiced mixed economies, planting crops while continuing to forage, raising some livestock while still hunting wild game, building semi-permanent homes while migrating seasonally to follow resources. These blended strategies blurred the boundary between forager and farmer. They spread risk across multiple food sources, preserved traditional ecological knowledge, and created resilience where monoculture would have brought fragility. In many cases, these hybrid systems supported communities more sustainably than the intensive, grain-dominated agriculture that later became dominant. Perhaps the deeper misstep wasn't farming itself, but the increasing specialization and dependency that came after, the shift to monocultures, the narrowing of diets, the total reliance on a handful of domesticated plants and animals. It's worth asking whether agriculture had to evolve the way it did. Nearly all of the world's great farming systems were built upon annual grains, wheat, rice, maize, crops that must be replanted every season, crops that demanded land clearing, soil tilling, endless weeding, and nutrient replacement, crops that were easily stored but also easily centralized, controlled, and taxed. But what if the dominant path had been different? What if humanity had leaned into perennial food systems, tree crops, tubers, nuts, forest gardens, that replenish themselves, require less labor, and resist monopolization? The indigenous peoples of the Amazon created biodiverse forest gardens, layering species into semi-wild abundance. In New Guinea, communities devised advanced methods for cultivating taro and other perennials. These approaches often proved ecologically gentle and socially resilient. Imagine if such systems had taken precedence over annual grain monocultures. World history might look profoundly different, and the story isn't over. Today, modern alternatives are being rediscovered and reinvented. Permaculture, agroforestry, regenerative food forests, all designed to echo natural ecosystems rather than erase them. Whether these approaches can sustain billions of people remains uncertain, but they remind us that we are not locked into a single agricultural destiny, that even 12,000 years after the first seeds were planted, new bargains remain possible. Of course, we cannot rewind the clock. There are simply too many of us now, and the wild lands that once nurtured our ancestors have been reshaped, diminished, or erased. The skills required to live entirely as foragers are mostly lost, and few would willingly give up the real benefits civilization has offered. Medicine that lengthens our lives, technology that allows instant communication across continents, art, music, and literature that enrich our existence in ways unimaginable to our Paleolithic ancestors. Yet acknowledging the double-edged legacy of agriculture might give us a chance to move forward with clearer vision, because the truth is this: progress has not come without cost. The agricultural revolution reshaped human health, deepened social inequality, and restructured our relationship with nature. It altered our bodies, our minds, and our communities, and though we cannot undo that choice, we can confront its consequences with greater awareness. We can design food systems that align better with our nutritional needs. We can pursue more equitable social structures in spite of surplus. We can reshape technologies to empower rather than constrain, and we can build ecological relationships rooted in reciprocity rather than exploitation. The true lesson of that ancient bargain is not to reject civilization, but to recognize it for what it is: a choice made by our ancestors under specific circumstances, at a specific moment in time, a choice with immense consequences that shaped our past and continue to mold our present, and most importantly, a choice that can still be revised, adapted, and reshaped as we face our own unprecedented challenges: climate change, mass extinction, inequality, and the alienation of modern life. Agriculture gave us the tools to transform landscapes, to concentrate knowledge, to build cities and technologies, but it also tethered us to particular ways of living. And now, as we confront the future, the question lingers: what bargains will we choose next? We find ourselves re-evaluating the very structures and bonds that once seemed essential, questioning whether they still serve us as we confront the limits of our planet and strive for more sustainable ways of living. Many scholars suggest that humanity today stands in the midst of a transformation as profound as the dawn of agriculture itself, on par with the rise of digital technologies, the move from industrial to information-driven society, and the shift from tangible goods to virtual realms of experience. Like our ancestors 12,000 years ago, we arrive at a turning point where the decisions we make will ripple across generations. Will we mirror their path, sacrificing independence for convenience, well-being for productivity, authentic connection for systems of control, or can we carve out a more balanced approach, one that embraces innovation without losing what makes us fundamentally human? The historian Jared Diamond once provocatively described agriculture as the worst mistake in the history of the human race. While that may exaggerate, his statement forces us to reconsider what we mean by progress. Agriculture undeniably brought immense benefits: populations expanded, knowledge accumulated, and civilizations flourished. Yet it also introduced steep costs. In exchange for growth came health challenges, widening inequality, and a fragile relationship with the natural environment. Too often these sacrifices are glossed over in our celebration of civilization's triumphs. The deeper lesson may not be that farming itself was an error, but rather that placing blind faith in a single model of advancement can be dangerous. History shows us that alternatives always exist, that other paths were possible, that other balances could have been struck, and that progress has never been one simple, unquestionable direction. As we lie in the quiet of night, we can imagine those early ancestors who first scattered seeds into the soil, who raised walls around permanent homes, who unknowingly set in motion the vast experiment still unfolding today. They could not have predicted the civilizations that would rise and collapse, the inventions that would transform the world, or the billions of descendants who would one day inhabit a planet remade by their choices. Their decisions were taken without the foresight of consequences, stretching millennia ahead. Our own choices too will echo far beyond our lifetimes, but unlike them we hold the benefit of hindsight. Archaeology traces the paths of those who came before. Anthropology reveals other ways of living. Science helps us weigh trade-offs and understand outcomes. We have tools to guide us if we choose to use them with awareness. The night grows deep. Above us the constellations burn in the same sky watched by farmers in their first villages, by nomads on the move before that, and by the earliest humans on the African plains. We carry their story within us, in our bodies, in our genes, in our institutions and ideas. Yet we also carry the ability to question, to reimagine, to shape differently, when circumstances demand it. This is our paradox: heirs of agriculture's revolution, beneficiaries of its abundance, but also potential reformers who can step beyond its constraints. We cannot go back to a pre-farming world, but neither must we remain confined within all the assumptions and compromises it produced. Perhaps this is the most enduring lesson of that first great turning point. Civilization did not emerge by fate alone, but by choice. A choice that opened some doors while closing others. And today, every field we cultivate, every city we construct, every institution we uphold or rework continues that decision. The night envelops us fully now. In its silence, the rhythm of breath and heartbeat links us to the farmers who tended the first wheat stalks, to the foragers who roamed long before them, to all the countless generations that shaped the human journey. Their choices mold our present, just as ours will mold the future for those yet to be born. So we must ask, what choices will we make? What seeds will we scatter? What harvest will we leave behind? These questions trail us into sleep, into the dreamscape where past and future touch. There the first farmers still bend under a Neolithic sun. There hunters and gatherers still wander through forests untouched. There all futures remain unclaimed, waiting to be chosen. Sleep descends like nightfall over an ancient settlement, like shadows stretching across freshly sown fields, like the curtain closing on humanity's oldest story, the tale of how we became who we are. Yet this story has no true ending. It renews with every sunrise, with every decision, with each new step into tomorrow. Built on the foundations laid 12,000 years ago, it is still unwritten, still unfolding, still alive. It flows onward through our questions, through our visions of what we might yet achieve, beyond the first bargains struck by our ancestors, into possibilities they could never have imagined, but which are now within our reach. Breath steadies, the mind grows quiet, sleep arrives gently, carrying us both backward and forward to the moment everything first shifted, to the seeds that started it all, and into the unknown futures awaiting our design. This inheritance, this legacy is both gift and responsibility. The human journey began in Africa, transformed with the birth of agriculture, and continues even now as we drift into dreams, dreams of what it means to be human in a world we have shaped, in a world that has shaped us, in a world still in the process of becoming.